A single suppressed shot during the consecration. A cathedral packed for Sunday Mass turns in an instant from sacred ritual to crime scene. The priest raises the host. The light through stained glass slices the nave into color. Somewhere near the third pew, a man bows his head. A muffled report. He folds forward. Confusion ripples through the congregation like a thrown pebble. For a city already schooled in fear, the sight of violence inside a house of worship was a new, terrible humiliation. This is the moment that would come to be remembered not merely as an assassination, but as a provocation whose reverberations were felt across Lebanon and beyond. The victim was Colonel Rashid Kurami, a Syrian military intelligence officer operating in Lebanon. The act itself has been widely attributed to Israeli intelligence. Reconstruction of the operation and its methods has been offered by intelligence analysts and later reported by historians and investigative journalists. Specific archival provenance for those public reconstructions is indefinable. What follows is a careful synthesis of those reconstructions, eyewitness fragments, and contemporaneous reporting. An attempt to trace how an operation carried out in a single, solemn minute became a chapter in the larger strategic contest over Lebanon. If this kind of slow-burn intelligence history interests you, subscribe for a full breakdown of Cold War-era covert action in the Middle East and the tradecraft that shaped it. To understand why a man would be targeted in a cathedral, and why the method chosen would risk outrage as well as tactical gain, one must first understand who Rashid Kurami was and how Lebanon had become a chessboard for power far beyond its borders. Colonel Rashid Kurami was not merely another intelligence officer. Operating in the fraught political geography of 1980s Lebanon, he occupied a role that made him both valuable and vulnerable. Embedded in Syrian military intelligence, Kurami's remit included coordinating Syrian relationships with Lebanese factions, overseeing logistics and arms deliveries, and running networks of agents whose reach crisscrossed Beirut's neighborhoods and the borderlands with Syria. To Syrian authorities, he was a trusted hand, tasked with keeping channels open and influence intact in a country where allegiances shifted like sand. For Israel and its intelligence services, Kurami represented a node. Weapons routed through Syria and into Lebanon had been used against Israeli forces and against communities close to the border. Analysts in Jerusalem linked certain arms flows and intelligence-supported raids to Syrian-controlled networks. In the calculus of covert action, eliminating a node, especially one who managed logistics and vetting of proxies, could disrupt the chain. But disruption has a price, and the calculus was never purely military. It was political, moral, and, perhaps most dangerously, symbolic. Lebanon itself was not a neutral stage for these calculations. The country had fractured under the weight of civil war, a mosaic of militias, sectarian enclaves, and the overlay of external patrons. Syrian forces were present in Lebanon with the ostensible responsibility of stabilizing the situation. In practice, Damascus exercised political control and deeply influenced which armed groups thrived or withered. Maronite Christian communities, some aligning with Syria out of expediency, others resisting, lived under a daily calculus of accommodation and suspicion. That Kurami, a Muslim and a representative of Syrian military power, would attend a Maronite cathedral for Mass is itself a detail that speaks to complexity rather than contradiction. An example of intelligence work that relied on blending into civilian textures. Why would a senior Syrian intelligence officer attend Mass in a Maronite cathedral without a visible security cordon? Several factors converged. Kurami cultivated local ties. Attending religious services could be a way to gather human information, to scan the room for agents, or to present a non-threatening public face. Churches in Beirut, occupied by congregants used to chaotic streets, could feel like sanctuaries in a literal and psychological sense. That perception of sanctuary and the resulting easing of personal security is what made such an appearance an exploitable vulnerability. Israeli intelligence's picture of Kurami's operations was not built on a single source. It was, as is typical in complex intelligence work, a mosaic. Intercepted communications, informant reporting, forensic analysis of weapons remnants from previous attacks, and patterns of movement observed by clandestine surveillance teams. Signals intelligence, SIGINT, reported in later reconstructions, suggested links between Syrian command nodes and shipments crossing the border. Human sources, HUMANT, placed Kurami at the nexus of logistical coordination, and forensic links between certain munitions used against Israeli targets and Syrian-supplied arsenals reinforced the hypothesis that his removal could degrade the flow. All of this, crucially, had to be balanced against political cost. An assassination inside a church would provoke moral outrage and political backlash. The sanctity of religious space was, and remains, one of the few near-universal constraints in modern warfare and clandestine operations. That constraint did not render the operation impossible in the eyes of planners. It forced them into a kind of operational arithmetic. How to extract the tactical value of removing Kurami while minimizing strategic and reputational damage. That arithmetic produced an audacious operational concept. Exploit the single moment when congregants are most fixed, when attention is focused, movement reduced, and the ritual requires attendees to stand in predictable patterns. In this case, planners identified the elevation of the host during the Maronite liturgy as a moment of ritual stillness and maximum visibility transmitter for precision. It was a moment when a single, precise action could be carried out with minimal kinetic fuss, no firefight, no prolonged exchange, a surgical puncture in time rather than a battle across hours. Tradecraft decisions followed. The weapon chosen would be small caliber, suppressed, and designed for silence. Reconstructions attribute the selection to a .22 handgun fitted with a suppressor and loaded with subsonic hollow points. Ammunition selected to maximize terminal effect at close range while minimizing the report and the risk of a ricochet that could harm others. Surveillance teams did repeated dry runs, mapping sight lines from various pews and aisles, noting how the late morning light changed the visibility of faces, and measuring the probability of an unobstructed shot from several vantage points. Surveillance also paid close attention to exit routes. Beirut's old city, with its narrow streets and network of alleys, offered both opportunity and danger for exfiltration. Planners identified a three-stage egress: immediate concealment within the building for a measured number of seconds, a rapid slide into a waiting vehicle parked outside a side entrance, followed by a layered exfiltration that mixed routine civilian traffic with a short secondary transfer to a safe house. The goal was distance and disorientation. Create enough movement away from the scene to prevent instant visual identification. Recon photos and maps used in later reconstructions show a path that threaded through market streets and short cut-throughs known only to operators who had rehearsed them. The operative selected for the job is referred to in some sources by the pseudonym Eli. Whether that name corresponds to an individual identity or is a constructed cover used in later accounts is unconfirmed. Where the name appears, it is always accompanied by caution. This is an operative identity that cannot be verified by public records. In the reconstructed narrative, Eli blends into the congregation, a man in nondescript clothing carrying a small prayer book, taking a seat several rows behind Kurami. He arrives alone, his physical posture unremarkable, his face a practiced mask of ordinary devotion. The plan depends on ordinariness. The best disguise in a cathedral full of the devout is to look like everyone else. Inside the planning room, debate is recorded in fragments of testimony given years later by intelligence veterans and anonymous memoirs. Some officers insisted that the operation would achieve a discrete objective, the removal of a logistic node disrupting supply lines. Others warned that the symbolic cost, violating a sanctuary, would outstrip the tactical benefit. The discussions reveal the perennial tension in clandestine services, the willingness to accept moral ambiguity when national survival is at stake, versus the recognition that legitimacy and moral standing are instruments of statecraft as well. Those debates were not purely abstract. Some in the apparatus feared the operation would harden Syrian resolve. invite retaliation, or alienate Lebanese Christian allies whose support could be decisive in the long term. The final go-ahead, in reconstructions, appears to have hinged on a moment of risk assessment that valued the immediate operational payoff. Decision-makers judged the benefits worth the hazard. If the removal of Kurami could significantly degrade Syrian-directed logistics and reduce the threat to Israeli forces and Israeli-adjacent communities, the thinking went, then the operation, if executed surgically, might be defensible in operational terms. Whether it would be defensible in moral or diplomatic terms was a question that some planners chose to set aside in pursuit of what they judged an urgent security objective. Preparations intensified. The operative's cover was strengthened. Photographs and seating patterns were studied until they felt familiar, like a well-rehearsed script. The suppressor was tested in controlled conditions to confirm its sound profile. The ammunition's ballistics were calculated against typical distances encountered in the nave. An abort protocol was established. If the target left early, or if unexpected security appeared, the plan would be shelved without incident. On March 19, 1987, the day chosen according to multiple reconstructions, the cathedral was full. St. George's Maronite Cathedral, one of Beirut's central places of worship, buzzed with the subdued energy of a congregation at peace enough to attend ritual and exchange the social small talk that grounds any community. Outside, the city carried on its usual hum. Inside, rows of worshippers formed a human lattice of heads and shoulders. The altar cast a bright pool of light on the priest as he led the liturgy. The reconstructed timeline that follows relies on later intelligence assessments and journalistic retellings. Timestamps given in this account are indicative, part of a minute-by-minute attempt to make sense of an event that lasted seconds but changed perceptions for years. 10:46:40. The priest reaches the part of the liturgy that precedes the elevation. Congregants bow, heads lower. It is a moment when bodies become still. 10:46:50. The operative, seated a few rows back, checks the angles one last time. There is a breath, like any other breath before prayer. A practiced exhalation of concentration. 10:47:12. A single suppressed shot. The sound is a soft pop. Less than would be expected outside the building, but inside the stillness it is enough to register as aberrant. A man in the third pew slumps forward. For a heartbeat, there is a sense of confusion rather than threat. Initial reactions misread physical collapse as a medical fainting. 10:47:15. Murmurs spread. A few heads crane toward the fallen figure. Someone shouts for help. The priest, following ritual, instinctively leans toward care. The operative rises with the calm of a man leaving after communion. He moves down the aisle, past faces turned toward the altar, past those still processing what they have seen. 10:47:30. The operative reaches the side exit. Outside, a small civilian vehicle idles as if waiting for a friend. He slips in. The vehicle pulls away with the ordinary cadence of traffic. Later reconstructions lay out a two-stage transfer. The waiting car drives only a short distance before transferring the operative to a secondary vehicle whose plates and driver profile are entirely different from the pattern of the first. Inside the cathedral, practical care replaces ritual. Someone dials emergency services. Witnesses describe a sudden shift from prayer to shouting. The body is moved, and only then is the seriousness of the event comprehended. The dead man is identified as Colonel Rashid Kurami. The news moves outward from the building like a dark bloom. The immediate physical aftermath was chaotic, people in shock, the priest attempting to restore order, worshippers surrounded by a grief made heavier by the sense of violation. The symbolism of violence inside a sacred space amplified the emotional damage. News spread through Beirut's neighborhoods and into the media with a mixture of facts and rumor. In the days that followed, different actors filled the explanatory void. Lebanese authorities launched an investigation. Syrian intelligence denounced the act and pointed fingers. International observers and religious leaders condemned the killing in part for the act itself and in part for its setting. Within Israel, the official line remained the standard policy of neither confirming nor denying clandestine operations. Silence from the official channels only compounded the atmosphere of suspicion. Some journalists and analysts pointed to operational hallmarks, weapon choice, timing, exfiltration routes that fit patterns associated with Israeli intelligence work. Intelligence analysts later argued that the precision of the operation, the targeting of a specific node without engaging in wider violence, and the sophistication of the exfiltration were consistent with a state actor possessing a high degree of tradecraft. Yet attribution, in this case as in many clandestine episodes, remained contested. Syrian officials and some Lebanese factions blamed Israeli agencies outright. Others cautioned that other groups in the region had motive and means. The methodological core of the Israeli reconstruction, if one accepts the public retellings, rests on three pillars. Signal intercepts indicating Syrian involvement in operations harmful to Israel. Forensic links tying certain weapon types and ammunition to supply chains traceable to Syrian sources, and human reports placing Kurami at the nexus of the logistical networks. Taken together, analysts asserted these elements created a plausible case that removing Kurami would have concrete tactical benefits. But plausibility is not proof. Public reconstructions, as noted, are drawn from intelligence analysts and later journalistic reporting. The specific documents or leaks underpinning those reconstructions are in some accounts identified, and in others left as indefinido. Where direct evidence is not publicly available, the argument becomes one of pattern and inference rather than disclosed proof. This ambiguity is central to understanding both the immediate reaction and the longer strategic consequences. An act whose attribution lives in the uneasy space between suspicion and confirmation tends to generate persistent political ripple effects precisely because it denies actors a clean narrative of responsibility and accountability. The operation's immediate tactical outcome was clear. A high-value individual lay dead within a sacred building, and a shadowy figure had vanished into the city. But clarity about consequence rarely follows clarity of act. Within hours and days, the killing produced shock, anger, and a scramble for narrative control. Religious leaders called for calm even as their congregations seethed. The Vatican and other Christian authorities issued statements lamenting the desecration of a sanctuary. In Damascus, state-controlled press treated the killing as an act of foreign aggression meant to destabilize the Syrian presence in Lebanon. Across Lebanese political lines, commentators assessed who might benefit and who would be harmed. For the planners who had greenlit the operation, the moment of advantage, the removal of Kurami's immediate capacity to direct shipments and run agents, was achievable. For the political strategists and diplomats who would have to live with the aftermath, the damage was more ambiguous. The killing tested loyalties among Lebanese Christians, pressured Syrian security doctrine, and sharpened the rhetorical weapons of those who objected to the violation of religious sanctuary. The incident forced a public and private reckoning about the limits of clandestine action. In the weeks that followed, investigators sifted the scene for technical traces. Ballistics and weapon fragments, when available, were analyzed against known signatures. Witness statements were compiled, often contradictory, norm in the fog of any sudden violence. Press accounts drew on unnamed sources inside security services and intelligence communities to construct narratives. Some of those accounts attributed the operation to Israeli agencies with varying degrees of certainty, others left attribution open. In reconstructing the method and motive, historians and intelligence analysts leaned on the congruence of operational details with known tradecraft and on the strategic logic that removal of a logistic coordinator presented. That reconstruction, however, was not simply a matter of identifying a culprit. It forced a wider debate. Within Israeli political and military circles, the episode reopened old fissures between those who argue that clandestine operations, however morally fraught, are necessary to protect the state, and those who worry that tactical successes can translate into strategic costs that erode the very security they claim to preserve. Internationally, the assassination in a cathedral raised questions about acceptable boundaries in covert action. Is sanctuary inviolable, even when a target uses that space for cover? Should religious spaces be considered off-limits categorically, or does the presence of a target negate sanctuary protections? The questions are not merely legalistic. They speak to how a state's moral authority survives in the public imagination. As the initial shock receded into the steady drum of reporting and official statements, one question took shape. How, day by day, would the truth, whatever shape of truth the public could hold, be assembled? Intelligence services do not typically hand their records to the public. What outlets had access to fragments of operational knowledge? Which former operatives or analysts were willing to speak on background decades later? How much of the narrative would be reconstructed from intersecting patterns rather than from smoking gun documents? Those who later wrote about the episode describe a patchwork process. Journalists trawled public statements and tapped retired officers for context. Historians sought corroboration in military records and diplomatic cables. Intelligence analysts relied on decades of pattern recognition to make sense of the operation's signature. Some reconstructions explicitly state their provenance, a combination of intercepted communications, forensic weapon linkage, and agent testimony. Others present their narrative without such explicit sourcing, a practice that obliges readers to treat conclusions with caution. Where specific archival releases have been cited, they strengthen the case for attribution. Where they are absent, the account remains an exercise in reasoned inference. Again, the documentary footprint for the public exposure of the operation is indefino in multiple retellings. What becomes clear in even the earliest stages of this story is that the act itself and the subsequent public attribution are two distinct operations. One kinetic, performed in a cathedral in a single fatal minute, the other discursive, stretched out over years, comprised of leaks, analyses, and memorializations. The first operation achieved its immediate objective. The second, how the world would come to understand responsibility, motive, and consequence, would unfold more slowly and with greater ambiguity. It is in that space between execution and attribution, the gap where tradecraft meets narrative, that the deeper strategic effects begin to germinate. An assassination is not only a tactical strike, it is a statement, and statements in the Middle Eastern theater are consumed and amplified by actors seeking advantage. Politically, the killing amplified Syrian claims of foreign interference. Mythologically, it violated a taboo by bringing violence into a house of worship. Legally and ethically, it raised questions about how far states could extend their covert hand. In the immediate aftermath, the focus is on the human scene. The stunned congregation, the priest caught between sacrament and emergency, the investigators combing for physical traces. But behind the scenes, the longer scripts are already being written. Security services in Damascus convene crisis meetings. Lebanese political leaders measure public reaction. Analysts in Jerusalem privately assess whether the operation yielded the expected degradation in Syrian logistics or whether instead it hardened Syrian systems against foreign penetration. For intelligence practitioners, one measure of operational effectiveness is not only whether the target was neutralized, but whether the broader objective, disruption of logistics, degradation of capabilities, or deterrence, was achieved without producing counterproductive consequences. In this case, the immediate result was the removal of a key figure. The downstream consequences, hardening, retaliation, political fallout, remain to be seen. As the city of Beirut processed the outrage and grief, the story began to collect versions. Some accounts emphasized the surgical nature of the operation. Others emphasized the transgression of sanctuary sacredness. Observers in the international community urged restraint, seeing in the assassination a possible escalatory spiral. Those inside intelligence circles who favored aggressive clandestine measures argued that the operation demonstrated the state's capacity to reach those who orchestrated violence against its citizens. Opponents countered that the moral price and diplomatic cost might outweigh any tactical advantage. And then there was the question of exposure. How would the method and the actor be revealed, or alleged, in public discourse? If Israeli intelligence was indeed the actor behind the operation, then what form would the exposure take? In some reconstructions, the disclosure was gradual and piecemeal. Analysts in Israel and abroad pieced together operational signatures, journalists published investigative features that pointed to likely actors, and historians later framed the event within the broader pattern of clandestine Israeli operations. In other versions, leaks, anonymous and unattributed, fed the public's appetite for closure. But in the present public record, the provenance of any comprehensive official exposure of the operation remains partially undefined. Several key claims are reconstructed by analysts and reporters from pattern evidence rather than supplied by a known single archival release. Where specific sources have been cited, they strengthen attribution. Where they have not, the conclusion remains circumspect. This ambiguity would itself become a part of the operation's legacy. Night fell on Beirut with a new apprehension. People moved through streets that now seemed more fragile. Congregations gathered for evening prayers and political meetings. In apartments and cafes, conversations turned to what would come next. For some, the killing was a necessary strike in a brutal contest of survival. For others, it was an unforgivable violation that desecrated a space of devotion. For the operatives and planners, success was a private, militarized fact. For the public, the event was a public spectacle demanding counting and judgment. By the time the initial funerary rites and the first formal condemnations had circulated, intelligence services on all sides were settling into longer campaigns of countermeasure. Syrian security tightened vetting and logistics. Lebanese factions recalibrated their alliances. Israeli planners counted the operational spoils and readied themselves for the inevitable political ripples. The assassination had closed one tactical chapter. It had opened several strategic ones that would play out over months and years. The immediate narrative, what happened in the cathedral and the characteristics of the operation, had been in many ways reconstructed with a level of technical detail that impressed colleagues and critics alike. The choice of weapon, the timing, the exfiltration plan, these spoke of deliberate tradecraft. Yet details alone cannot answer the moral questions. The dialogue over whether the act was justified in light of the intelligence it purportedly neutralized had only begun. That conversation would move from operating rooms and intelligence briefs into diplomatic channels and public fora, where moral language and political calculus often collide. What remained unresolved, even as the city stitched itself back together, was the shape of the truth that would inform subsequent memory. Would the act be remembered as a precise, necessary blow to a dangerous network, or as an indelible stain on the norms that protect sacred spaces? Would exposure of method and attribution, reconstructed by analysts and later described by journalists, satisfy a thirst for accountability, or would the ambiguity of public evidence leave a persistent, corrosive doubt? Those questions were not theoretical. They bore directly on how neighboring states and internal actors would respond. An operation that could be plausibly attributed to a rival power without incontrovertible proof can be more destabilizing than a clearly declared act of war. The ambiguity can be exploited by those who seek to rally support, justify repression, or claim victimhood. In Lebanon's fractured polity, where political narratives are a currency as potent as weaponry, the assassination's meaning would be contested relentlessly. This is where the story shifts from the flash of a suppressed shot to the slow, grinding work of attribution, diplomacy, and moral accounting. The clip of violence inside a cathedral becomes, in the hands of historians and intelligence analysts, a case study in the limits and costs of clandestine action. In reconstructing the operation, analysts would point to the precision and the targeted nature of the attack as evidence of professional tradecraft. Critics would point to the choice of location and the public fallout as evidence of strategic short-sightedness. As investigators collect witness statements and as journalists comb through leaks and anonymous briefings, a broader picture of the operation's prelude and execution begins to assemble. The narrative of the act is no longer only an act. It becomes a mirror reflecting choices made in the closed rooms of security services and the public consequences those choices produce. The cathedral, once a place of private devotion, now functions as a theater in which the ethical dimensions of covert action are performed for a global audience. Yet even as the initial threads of attribution are gathered, uncertainties persist. Not every claim can be anchored to a named source. Not every operative can be identified by name rather than by the pseudonyms that emerge in later accounts. And crucially, not every consequence can be measured in immediate tactical terms. Some unfold over decades. In the next phase of the story, the phase that will be explored in greater depth in the following analysis, investigators and analysts move from the scene to the archives, from eyewitness testimony to the mosaic of signals and reports that purport to illuminate motive and authorship. Diplomatic cables spike with urgency. Religious leaders continue to press for restraint, while political actors probe for advantage. And the question at the heart of the matter, the balance between short-term security gains and long-term strategic and moral costs, begins to harden into the real debate that will shape policy and public memory alike. What followed the minute that reshaped so many lives was less a single revelation than a long, patient accumulation of evidence, hypothesis, and counterclaim. A slow public unspooling in which intelligence tradecraft, journalism, history, and politics. The operative act happened in a breath. The unmasking took years. Investigators first worked the obvious avenues: the scene inside St. George's, possible exit routes, witness statements. But clandestine attribution seldom rests on eyewitness testimony alone, especially when witnesses were stunned, disoriented, and reluctant to speak in a city where saying too much could be dangerous. Instead, the reconstruction that later framed public understanding relied on multiple, intersecting strands: signals collected by state services, human reporting, pattern analysis of weapons signatures and tactics, and the kind of institutional memory only seasoned intelligence professionals possess. Where those strands converged, analysts argued, a persuasive account of authorship and method emerged. Where they did not, the record remained ambiguous. Throughout, specific archival provenance for a comprehensive official exposure is indefinito. Signals intelligence, as later reconstructions suggest, provided critical context. Intercepts collected in the months before the assassination, reconstructed from accounts by analysts and later circulated studies, allegedly mapped the contours of Syrian logistics and command nodes that coordinated arms flows into Lebanon. Those communications did not, on their face, order an assassination. Instead, they sketched a network: radio chatter, movement reports, coordination between logistics centers and militias. That mosaic helped establish Kurami's operational importance, why he mattered as a node, rather than pointing explicitly to the hand that decided to remove him. Human intelligence supplied the temporal immediacy. Informants, handlers, and local spotters placed Kurami at meetings, near warehouses, and in the networks that distributed material to militias whose weaponry had been implicated in attacks. In later journalistic retellings and analyses, anonymous on-background sources described how such reporting allowed planners to identify both vulnerability and opportunity. Those accounts, often attributed to retired officers or unnamed officials, are part of the public reconstruction, but their anonymity means they strengthen plausibility more than they provide conclusive disclosure. Forensic analysis of weapons and ammunition fragments, when available, offered another piece of the puzzle. Ballistics laboratories can link rifling patterns, cartridge material, and primer types to manufacture runs or modification profiles. Forensic experts who spoke on condition of anonymity to reporters described how certain ammunition traced to supply chains consistent with Syrian-provided arsenals. In many of the reconstructions, those forensic threads are presented as corroborative rather than dispositive. They align with the intelligence picture that Kurami was involved in logistics, but do not by themselves identify an executing agency. Again, where specific forensic reports have been cited in public accounts, their provenance strengthens attribution. Where they haven't, the evidence remains circumstantial. Perhaps most consequential in shaping the narrative of exposure were the pattern signatures, the collection of operational hallmarks that intelligence practitioners recognize as a kind of tradecraft fingerprint. Precise timing during ritual stillness, the choice of low-visibility dressing, the blend-in with civilian crowd technique, the two-stage exfiltration. Analysts familiar with clandestine operations observed that the operation bore hallmarks consistent with a professional service operating in the theater. Those judgments, however, are assessments of method, not admissions of responsibility. Analysts concluded, and public reporting relayed, that such tradecraft was consistent with a state actor possessing the capability for careful reconnaissance and disciplined execution. In public reconstructions, that consistency is frequently cited as a principal reason the operation has been widely attributed to Israeli intelligence, even as definitive documentary proof remained unpublished. In Defino, journalism played the role of thread finder. Investigative reporters over subsequent years attempted to stitch together available fragments. Unattributed briefings from former officials, leaked or declassified cables when they appeared, interviews with witnesses and retired operatives, and context drawn from regional diplomatic records. Some long-form pieces presented detailed reconstructions of tactics and motives. Others offered more circumspect accounts that emphasized the limits of publicly accessible evidence. Where journalists cited named archival materials, their claims carried greater weight. Where they relied on anonymous sources and pattern analysis, they invited skepticism. The result was an evolving public narrative that tilted toward attribution, widely believed, reconstructed by analysts, consistent with known tradecraft, while stopping short of incontrovertible admission. The public framing of exposure thus was less a single document than a composite, investigative features that assembled the tradecraft picture, historians who placed the killing within the broader pattern of clandestine operations of the era, and intelligence commentators who read the operation as symptomatic of a strategic posture that prized surgical removal of nodes. Each new piece of reporting or historical work nudged public understanding in a particular direction. Press attention focused not only on authorship but on method, how a state could reach into a cathedral, strike, and disappear. That emphasis drove the ethical debate as much as the attribution conversation. Policy elites and intelligence communities on all sides reacted predictably. Tighten, adapt, retaliate where possible, and explain to domestic audiences without revealing sources or methods. In Damascus, the killing was framed as an illegal act of aggression. State-controlled media emphasized the violation of a sacred place to mobilize political sentiment, both domestically and among Lebanon's allies. Syrian security services instituted stricter countermeasures, improved vetting of personnel movements, more rigorous controls on those who could attend public religious events without protective details, and increased surveillance of suspected networks. The objective in Damascus was twofold: protect security assets, and shape the narrative that the regime was the victim of hostile foreign interference. In Lebanon, reactions varied across a fractured polity. Maronite leaders, aghast at violence in a house of worship, demanded investigation and accountability. For some Christian politicians, the assassination deepened suspicions about outside interference and hardened attitudes toward Syria. For others, the event reinforced the precarious calculus of alignment, how to balance relations with Damascus against local autonomy and security. The assassination aggravated communal anxieties and, in certain constituencies, deepened polarization. Yet, it also prompted some local leaders to call for restraint and dialogue, fearful that inflammatory rhetoric could spiral into renewed cycles of violence. Inside Israel, the reaction was more complicated and largely private. Publicly, officials observed the standard posture of neither confirming nor denying covert actions. Privately, accounts that later emerged in memoirs, interviews, and analytical pieces reveal acute debate. Some intelligence veterans argued that removing a pivotal logistics coordinator was an unavoidable necessity given the harms believed to flow from Syrian-directed arsenals. Others warned that the moral and political costs, particularly the damage to Israel's international standing and the offense caused to religious communities, could undercut broader strategic goals. Those internal debates shaped future operational doctrine. Reconstructed accounts and later reflections by intelligence professionals suggest that the episode contributed to a reassessment of certain risk thresholds. Whether to accept operations that would produce high symbolic costs, how to weigh the sanctity of non-combatant and religious spaces in planning, and the trade-offs between precision kinetic options and methods that allowed for greater deniability or less provocative optics. In practice, this meant an increased emphasis in some quarters on remote means, satellite-enabled strikes, standoff methods, or on operations crafted to minimize public visibility. Whether this recalibration was universal across services or limited to specific directorates is less clear in the public record. What is evident is that the assassination entered the institutional memory as a cautionary exemplar. The regional strategic reverberations are harder to measure, but no less real. Syrian security doctrine grew more insulated and suspicious after the attack. Networks were compartmentalized, handlers vetted more stringently, and the political rhetoric hardened. Lebanese factions adjusted their patterns of cooperation and protection. More broadly, the event fed into the mosaic of grievances and countermeasures that, over years and decades, shaped Lebanon's trajectory. It is historically defensible to say that the assassination contributed to a longer arc of mistrust, recalibration, and pressure that, along with many other dynamics, including domestic Lebanese politics, international pressures, and subsequent high-profile incidents, helped condition the environment that ultimately yielded shifts in Syrian posture and presence in Lebanon by the mid-2000s. But causality here is plural and distributed. The cathedral killing was one significant element among many in a complex sequence of cause and effect. The ethical conversation animated by the assassination reached beyond immediate policy circles. Legal scholars, theologians, and human rights advocates debated the permissibility of targeting individuals inside religious sites. Some argued that sanctuary protections must be upheld to preserve minimum norms of human dignity and religious freedom, asserting that even a legitimate military target does not erase the sanctity of sacred space. Others posed the counter-argument that where a combatant or operative uses civilian settings as cover, sanctuary protections are morally complicated and operationally exploitable. International law does provide protections for civilian objects and critical cultural and religious sites. How those protections apply to clandestine operations in irregular conflict environments is contested and context-dependent. The assassination became a reference point in these debates, used to illustrate the stakes of decisions that place operational advantage against normative constraints. Beyond policy and law, the assassination also altered the lived memory of Beirut's communities. For many worshippers who were present that morning, the image of a cathedral transformed into a crime scene fractured personal sense of safety and religious solace. Priests and community leaders struggled to pastorally process the trauma while engaging in public advocacy. Ritual life persisted, but with an indelible mark. The ordinary rhythm of prayer now contained a memory of vulnerability. For Kurami's own family and his network, the death was at once a personal loss and proof of how small the margin for life can be in a contested city. Historians who later wrote about the episode drew attention to another consequence: the way the public exposure of the operation itself became a political instrument. Reconstructions published by journalists and academics helped shape public memory and policy debates, but they also created openings for actors to exploit ambiguity. Competing narratives: the state as defender, striking necessary blows; the state as transgressor, violating sacred norms, were both politically potent. Ambiguity intensified political utility. The less certain attribution was in the public record, the more room there was to use the event rhetorically. For Syrian authorities and sympathetic Lebanese factions, the assassination served as evidence of hostile foreign intervention. For critics of aggressive clandestine policy, it became an emblem of moral overreach. Within intelligence communities, the episode also provoked introspection about how exposure occurs. An operation's tradecraft can be flawless in the moment, and yet later leave patterns that interested parties may trace. Retirement and defection of personnel, leaks to the press, forensic advances that make linking weapons more precise, and the patient work of historians assembling public records all contribute to eventual reconstructions. Practitioners learned, if not before, that operational secrecy is not an eternal guarantee. Over time, the mosaic of signals, documents, testimonies, and open-source clues can coalesce into a public account that, while not always complete, can be sufficiently detailed to shape policy debates and to alter reputational landscapes. The narrative of exposure in public discourse, how Mossad's alleged role and the operation's method were reconstructed, followed this arc of aggregation. Analysts and historians later framed the assassination as an operation whose signatures matched those of a professional intelligence service. Investigative reporting consolidated those signals into readable accounts for the public. But in many public retellings, the specific documents or admissions that would transform plausibility into certainty remained absent or classified. Hence, again, indefinito, where archival provenance is not specified. This epistemic gap is itself telling. It is a reminder that in clandestine affairs, the absence of official confirmation is often filled by inference, pattern analysis, and the considered judgment of experts. Time did not erase consequence. In the years after the assassination, Syria modified security practices. Lebanese political alignments shifted incrementally. Israeli planners revisited risk thresholds and collateral narratives. The cathedral killing became a reference in training and doctrine, an example of a high payoff operation that also produced outsized symbolic costs. In classrooms and seminars on intelligence ethics, the episode was cited as a case where technical success demanded a broader ethical appraisal, one that includes reputational, diplomatic, and long-term strategic dimensions. Within parliamentary debates and public fora, the killing was invoked by critics who argued for greater oversight and by defenders who maintained the necessity of decisive covert measures in a hostile environment. The moral weight of the episode persists in a key way. It forced a broader public conversation about the limits of statecraft in irregular theaters. That conversation matters because clandestine operations do not occur in a moral vacuum. They are performed by states that seek legitimacy not only through security outcomes but through adherence to international norms and domestic values. When an operation transgresses a widely recognized taboo, the sanctity of a place of worship, it risks eroding the moral capital a state needs to sustain long-term policy aims. Strategists and practitioners learned that tactical effects must be weighed against the intangible currency of legitimacy. As the years unfolded, scholars and analysts probed the longer-term connections between operations like the cathedral assassination and larger geopolitical shifts. They documented how Syrian authorities tightened their inner circles, how Lebanese factions learned to exploit narratives of violation, and how international actors used the event as a rhetorical touchstone in diplomatic forums. The assassination did not by itself redraw borders or instantly overturn foreign policy, but in a fractious region where symbolism and perception are as influential as missiles, the operation's reverberations contributed to an evolving strategic texture. a mixture of increased securitization, hardened political stances, and a more contested moral discourse about the limits of covert action. The story's final, enduring lesson is not a tidy moral verdict, but a cautionary complexity. The removal of a dangerous artery in an adversarial network can produce immediate operational benefits. It can also produce durable political and moral costs that reshape the environment in ways that sometimes make subsequent operations more difficult and public support more fragile. The cathedral killing is therefore both an intelligence case study and a moral puzzle. It reveals how clandestine services pursue immediate security objectives while operating within a world of lasting reputational stakes. By the time historians and analysts assembled the publicly available reconstructions, the phrase "exposed" often accompanied accounts of the operation. Yet exposure, in this context, rarely means an official confession. Instead, the exposure is procedural and piecemeal. Analysts reconstructed method and motive from signals, human reporting, forensics, and pattern recognition. Journalists published narratives based on those reconstructions and on anonymous briefings. Historians integrated those accounts into the broader archival fabric of the period. In many public retellings, the claim that Mossad was responsible is presented as widely believed, attributed to, or reconstructed by intelligence analysts and later reported by investigative journalists and historians. Specific documentary or archival evidence tying the operation definitively to an official admission or a named internal document is indefinito in multiple public accounts. That qualification matters. It reflects the epistemic norms of responsible historical and journalistic practice. Where the documentary footprint is incomplete, authors qualify their claims. Where leaks or admissions exist, they are cited. Readers and viewers must therefore navigate a landscape of reasoned inference, corroborative patterns, and the occasional revealing testimony. The absence of an official admission does not erase the plausibility of attribution. It only tempers the certainty with which one can assert it. As this narrative closes, the cathedral incident stands as a case study of the paradox at the heart of clandestine statecraft. Operations designed to protect national life may also erode the moral and political foundations that make protection sustainable. The tactical calculus that authorized a suppressed shot in a house of worship delivered a narrow military outcome, but unleashed a cascade of political, communal, and ethical consequences that neither planners nor politicians could fully control. Was the operation justified by the security threat Kurami allegedly represented, or did it cross an unforgivable line by violating sanctuary and inflaming a region already steeped in wounds? The answer depends on the weight one assigns to immediate tactical benefits versus long-term moral and diplomatic costs. Intelligence professionals will assess the balance in operational terms. Ethicists, religious leaders, and many observers will judge it by broader normative standards. History records the action and its ripples. It does not grant a simple verdict. If you have thoughts about where the balance should fall, security necessity or inviolable sanctuary, share them in the comments. And if you want sources and a reading list that informed this reconstruction, reporting, later analyst essays, and historical treatments, check the description for a curated bibliography and recommended further reading.